One of the questions that has transcended time, place, location, race, culture, and religion is the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And today I'm going to be talking about one of the essentials of that question, and that relates to the topic of human sin. I'm going to address 8 specific areas particularly. Hello, my name is Darren Woods, and welcome to today's episode of the Bible Study Matters podcast. As I mentioned, we're going to be addressing head on this question of why do bad things happen to good people, focusing primarily today on what's meant by human sin and the implications and consequences of human sin based upon and measured by the holy, omnipotent, all powerful, all knowing attributes of God. So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about human sin within the lens of it being definable. Human sin is, in fact, definable. Theologian R.C. Sproul talked about the fact that sin is cosmic treason against God. I tend to try to hone it down a little bit more specifically and focus on the fact that sin involves any thought or action which either intentionally or unintentionally falls outside of God's will and His Word in terms of the Bible. And a lot of this conversation about human sin and its relationship to the question about why do bad things happen to good people is because people are not clear with regard to this definition of sin. You may have your own working definition of sin, and it's not my intent today to micromanage the nuances of verbiage, but it has to do with the things that happen, behaviors and thoughts outside, as I said, whether intentionally or unintentionally, outside the will of God and outside the Word of God, the Holy Scriptures. All right. So that's the first means to which we're addressing this essential question as it relates to human sin. All right. The second thing that we need to understand about human sin is that human sin is historical. There is a record of this. Human sin is not something that was invented yesterday or even 100 years ago. You find references to human sin throughout the Bible, particularly with regard to the first and second chapters of the book of Genesis, where we learn about God's creation of the universe, of humanity, of male, of female, of creatures, of the oceans, of land, of sea. Sin is historically recorded in the first 2 chapters in the book of Genesis. In addition, we find that humans have eternal souls. The Bible talks about in the second chapter of Genesis, the second chapter in the 7th verse, that God breathed in to man. And this idea of God breathing into man had to do with the fact that he created Adam and breathe this life into him. And part of that has to do with and resulted in humans having souls, our souls living eternally. And so this idea that has a historical record is important to understand the concept of why bad things happen to good people. All right. And we see specifically a reference to this in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, where we find the fall of man, where both Adam and Eve sinned against God, and their disobedience to God's instruction with regard to eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is something that triggered a series of events involving sin that has a ripple effect even to this day. All right. So again, sin is historical. The next thing I want to point out with regard to sin is that sin is hereditary. And this closely relates to the historical nature of sin. All right. Sin is hereditary. And so I want to look at a couple scriptures with regard to this. Particularly, we find in Romans, the 3rd chapter and the 23rd verse, these words: "For all have sinned and fallen short or fall short of the glory of God." Now, you don't have to really be a theologian to understand what this word all means. All means all, right? Every single person who has been born into this world have sinned and have fallen short of God's glory. And this idea of falling short doesn't have to do with, barely missing it. Like, it's only a little bit off. Humans are a little bit short of understanding God's glory. This is as short as east is to west. It's not even close. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All right. And we find it in another verse as well in Romans, the 5th chapter, verses 12 through 14. These verses, I'm going to read them here. Therefore, this is Apostle Paul talking here. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sin. You see that? You notice that again, even in this verse, all sin. For unto the law, sin is in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Here we go. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even for those who did not sin, in the likeness of the offense of Adam, who is a type of him who is to come. And this him, capital H, has to do with Jesus Christ. This idea of a type is important. As sin entered through the world, through Adam, the penalty from sin comes through Jesus Christ. All right. So sin, again, is hereditary. It is something that is passed down from generation to generation. As I often like to say, we are all part of the Addams family. All right. So the third point with regard to this idea of human sin is that human sin is unavoidable. Not only is it something that is something that we think that we can get around or get past, it is in fact unavoidable. And we're going to look at another verse staying in the book of Romans, and we're looking particularly at Romans, the 7th chapter, verses 19 through 21. You can see the verses on the screen here, all right? And I'm going to read this here. For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. Paul is talking about this great contrast in terms of the things that he wants to do. He does not, he wants to please God. He does not want to sin. He does not want to go against the will and the word of God. And then we see in the 20th verse here, this conjunction, but, right? And but stands out in terms of the means through which is a contrast with regard to what has previously been said. I want to do good, but if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. All right. And we're going to land on particularly the 21st verse, which says, I find then the principle that evil is present with me, the one who wants to do good. The evil one, the evilness, that has to do with sin. Sin is something that is unavoidable. If you are living, if you are breathing, it doesn't matter if you are a child or adult, sin is unavoidable. And Apostle Paul makes this very, very clear with regard to this specific characteristic involving sin. All right? Okay. So we're now going to look at another characteristic of sin, and that is sin is individual. You know, a lot of individuals talk about, well, the fairness of God's holding us accountable to the standard with regard to his personal holiness. Well, sin is individual. Even though it is something that is hereditary, even something that is unavoidable, each and every one of us been involved in sin in one way or another. Now, where do we see this? We see this in a number of passages in Scripture, and I'm not going to go through all these specifically by reading, but write these down because you can look at them at your leisure. All right. So we find in in 2 Samuel, the 11th through 12th chapters, the story of King David and Bathsheba. Right. King David committed adultery, extramarital affair, if you will, with Uriah's wife. Now, Uriah was one of his soldiers, one of his warriors, and um, at some point, David was looking outside and noticed Uriah's wife Bathsheba bathing, and it wasn't the first look that was the sin. It was the second look and continuing look and the thought process that went into King David's mind, in terms of him wanting to have sex with her. Quite honestly, this this movement and this lust in his flesh for Bathsheba led to additional sins. One of which included lying. Right? After he slept with Bathsheba, he wanted to cover up. You and I would refer to it as a cover up, right? What did Watergate tell us in terms of President Nixon? The cover up is worse than crime. In this particular case, there's no distinction in God's mind in terms of the crime of sin and the covering up of sin. It's piling on layers upon layers upon layers with regard to this sin here. And so this desire by David led to the cover up as well. What did he try to do? He tried to cover up the fact that he had sexual relationships with Bathsheba and she was pregnant with his child. How did he do this? He facilitated the murder of Uriah. First, he wanted Uriah on his leave to return and have relationships with his wife. And Uriah basically said, no, I cannot do that. I do not want to have relationships with my wife. King David, I want to go back on the front line. And so what David realized at that particular point is, you know what? I'm not going to be able to cover this up if Uriah returns and realizes that his wife is pregnant. So what did King David do? He made arrangements for Uriah to go in the very, very heat in the front lines of battle with regard to that. That is an individual sin on the part of David. And don't get me wrong, right? David often gets the blame, if you will, in this particular story in the Bible. But Bathsheba bears fault as well. This also was sin on her particular part as well, realizing even though there was a power dynamic with regard to King David, she was a co-conspirator in the sin. There's individual sin committed on her part as well. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, in contrast to sin being individual, sin is also collective, right? It can occur within a group of individuals. It's not just one individual. Well, where do we see this? Well, we find this in Exodus, the 32nd chapter, and the 1st through 35th verses with regard to Israel at the base of Mount Sinai, waiting for Moses to return with what we refer to as the Ten Commandments. What did they do collectively? They were impatient. They did not want to wait to see what God told to Moses. They were fearful. They were scared. And unfortunately, leading the way was Aaron's brother. And that led to a collection of jewelry and items in which the Israelites molded a golden calf to worship that golden calf. That involved a collective sin. Again, sin is a part of the human experience. We are born into it. It's hereditary. It is passed down. It is unavoidable. But the entire nation of Israel was held responsible for that collective, total sin on their part. All right. So sin is collective. All right. Now, the next point I want to spend a little bit more time on, and the phrasing may be slightly unusual for you. It may be worded slightly different, or you may have heard of it being worded slightly differently. but I want to focus on the fact that sin is commissive and dismissive. You may have heard of the phrase sins of omission and sins of commission. Let's take a look at this, all right? Let's first talk about the sin of commission. And the sin of commission, as the name involves an action, right? An action, a thought, or behavior, something that someone does, right? We think of the idea of committing a crime, all right? We're going to take a look at, let's see here, Psalms, the 23rd chapter and the 7th verse. Psalms 23:7 reads, "For as he thinks within himself, so is he. He says to you, eat and drink, but his heart is not with you." What are we talking about here? We're talking specifically with regard to this idea that, let's see here, just a second. All right. We're talking specifically with regard to the idea that sin can be something that people do, an action, a thought, or behavior, right? We think of the Ten Commandments in terms of the things that we should do, all right? And Psalms, the 23rd chapter and the 7th verse also remind us that it's not just our actions, it's actually our thoughts as well. That the way we think or what we think in terms of what we would like to do can also be something that is a sinful action. So in contrast to the sins of commission, we have this idea of sins of omission, okay? Sins of omission. And we find this in James, the 4th chapter and the 17th verse. So let's look here. Let's look back here at James, the 4th chapter and the 17th verse. And it says, "Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin," right? Again, this idea of sin of omission. You know, we try to play word games and wordsmith. We try to outsmart God, which is never going to happen. And in our minds, we think, well, I didn't do X, Y, and Z. But here it makes it very, very clear. James is making it clear that our inaction what we decide, choose not to do, can be a sin as well. When we know to do right and don't do that. All right. So our next point is the fact that human sin is redeemable. It may have seemed like so far throughout what I've said for the first 7 categories or things to consider with regard to human sin that all is lost. You may be thinking to yourself, well, my goodness gracious, because of sin, the deck is already stacked against me. You know what? You're right. It is stacked against you. However, and this is wonderful, this is beautiful. However, sin is redeemable. And you may be asking yourself the question, well, how is that so? Well, let's take a look at, again, we're returning to Romans, right? Romans, the 5th chapter, verses 15 through 17. And just as a side note, if you have not read or not familiar with the book of Romans, please dig into that. It has so much rich doctrine and direction and really helps us address this question again of why do bad things happen to good people? Romans, the 5th chapter, verses 15 through 17 reads, But the free gift is not like the transgression. For if by the transgression of one, the many died, and by the one, again, it's making an allusion to Adam, right? The first man, the first human, and Adam and Eve, and the sin which entered through them. The one, the many died, much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of one man. And you may ask the question, who is that man? I'm glad you asked that question. Paul addresses it. Who is the one man? Jesus Christ, abound to the many. All right. So this idea that sin is something that we cannot get over. It is stacked against us. It is something that we have no hope for. Cannot be further from the truth. Jesus Christ lived, died, was buried, and rose again for the sins of all humanity, past, present, and future. But to understand and really have a very honest, frank, and biblical perspective based conversation regarding this question of why do bad things happen to good people, we have to understand that one of the reasons that bad things happen to good people is because of human sin. On our next podcast, we're going to be talking about the other side of the coin, and that has to do with God's sovereignty. Take care. God bless you. Thanks for joining the Bible Study Matters podcast.